Hello and welcome to my presentation entitled A Risk-Based Approach to Biomedical Device Maintenance. It is authored by myself, Adrian Richards, and my colleague Glenn Kennett, and we're both from Adelaide in South Australia. Firstly, to give you some context and describe the setting in which we work, here within Australia, the majority of acute or tertiary healthcare is provided by the government in public hospitals. They are government funded and government run. It is a public health service funded by taxpayers. Clinical engineering staff working within that setting are employed by the government. They are public servants. In the state of South Australia, and Adelaide is the capital city of South Australia, there are approximately 4,500 public hospital beds. It is one of the smaller of the capital cities in Australia, with a population of slightly less than 2 million. And for a short time here in our state, clinical engineering services across the public health system were centrally managed. This brought a number of advantages at the time, not the least of which, for the benefit of this exercise we're describing here today, is that we ended up with a single database for all medical devices across the health system, and that totaled some 120,000 devices. Amongst other things, that presented us with the opportunity to substantially revise our approach to health technology management generally, and more specifically, how we managed our scheduled maintenance program. We're lucky here in Australia in that clinical engineering activities are defined by a standard as voluntary but universally applied, and that is the Australian and New Zealand Standard 3551, entitled Management Programs for Medical Equipment. That is essentially like a quality system for health technology management, and I'd encourage you just to search that on the internet if you're keen to learn a little more about that standard. The aims that we had in mind for this exercise in improving our approach to the management of planned maintenance was really to apply some science to our approach and use both risk and evidence as the basis for decisions around our support. We thought it was well and truly time to move on from what was some more traditional approaches, and these included things like strictly following manufacturers' recommendations or checking everything every 12 months, and really move towards optimum resource utilization, and certainly embrace the concept of run to failure, which is something which had been gaining momentum internationally for some time. The need, of course, was to remain fully compliant with Australian standards, particularly Australian Standard 3551 that I mentioned in my previous slide, and that has some very clear recommendations, and it includes, as a default position, follow the manufacturer's recommendations for scheduling routine service, or, and this is the clause that we were using, document the rationale for any variation from manufacturer's recommendations. That left the door clearly open to take a smart, science-based approach to our activities. There was the ongoing or the overarching need, of course, to close the loop and look at the outcomes from our approach at regular intervals, and we chose a period of 3 years for every risk assessment that we did and every change that we made to our planned maintenance to fine-tune that on an ongoing basis. The decision-making process that we used as part of our risk assessment had a few key decision points that we needed to take into account. The first of those was any legislated requirements that may exist around equipment maintenance. These are in fact very few in Australia and mainly centre around equipment that produces ionising radiation. We of course take manufacturers' recommendations into account as one factor, and a good example of where these really come into play is where there might be non-durable parts, and take for example where a ventilator may need a 1,000-hour kit, otherwise failure is imminent. We of course take into account the latent or inherent risk in devices, and that can be clinical, financial, legal. There's a whole range of facets to that risk which we take into account. The power source for the equipment is important. Obviously, mains, wall powered versus battery operation. The environment in which the equipment is used. The hospital and the home are very different in terms of the personnel involved in using the equipment, of managing the patient, and so we certainly take into account the differences between that and home use, where it might be a lay person who has very little experience. And the protection incorporating the facility power wiring. We also are fortunate in Australia to have another standard which dictates a range of protective measures which must be built into the electrical wiring in areas which medical equipment is utilised. Don't try and interpret this slide. It's purely used to diagrammatically represent the process that we follow. So those key points that I've just outlined are taken into account in a flowchart decision process. Basically, we feed a device in the top end, in the start box, and at the bottom end, the yellow boxes coming out of the decision-making process are recommendations of what we'll perform in terms of preventative maintenance or performance verification, and when we will perform it, or the intervals between those episodes, and that can be run to failure through to 1 year, 2 year, or 5 year intervals. The mechanism for undertaking these risk evaluations or risk assessments has evolved substantially over the years, and we now use an online smart form that guides staff through the decision-making process. This has pull-down menus and options and records the results of the evaluation in a form which is shown on the right of this slide. This assessment is undertaken by a senior staff member at a site that has the most examples of the device being assessed, and it is reviewed and subsequently discussed, modified, and finally signed off by a senior staff member at another site, and that could well be the site, for example, that has the second most number of examples of the device being assessed. This is a process which is now very mature, and we have performed large numbers, hundreds of these evaluations. As mentioned in an earlier slide, regular review of our approach is essential to ensure that we close the loop and use evidence on an ongoing basis to modify our approach. It would be unacceptable to simply make changes and then not review the impact and outcomes arising from those changes. We run a series of automated reports as a means of undertaking those reviews, and they take into account a number of factors. These include a flag, which is triggered by a technician during a service episode, which might tell us that insufficient PM has been undertaken, which has precipitated a failure. Take a very simple example: a battery has failed, and that failure could have been prevented by replacing that battery at a short interval. The number of corrective work orders is measured and trended, and we look for increasing trends in those. We see whether that might be an indicator of the effectiveness of our strategy, and also a classic measure, mean time between failures, is also utilised. How long did it take us to get to this current point? We've been working on this program for a number of years. It is now well embedded, and we spent the equivalent of one person for approximately 12 months to get us to this point. Substantial student project time. Undergraduate students undertaking placements at our sites also provided substantial input. We do the assessments at a number of levels, from make model specific through just the device category level, and we've done many hundreds of these assessments in a very comprehensive manner. We have around 40% of our devices that are not scheduled for testing. They are run to failure, and although cost savings has not been an objective of this program, we're really looking to just make best utilisation of our resources. We have seen some significant savings, and that may well be an indicator that some areas were perhaps over-servicing and maybe following manufacturers' recommendations when that might not have been the best plan. This is now embedded in practice and widely accepted by clinicians and healthcare executives across the state, and as mentioned, we have well over 100,000 devices being managed in this way. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to receive questions. My contact details are there.